It was the summer of 2001 inside the New Orleans Saenger Theatre, a night thick with heat and history, where the air hummed with the warmth of brass bands drifting in from the streets and the anticipation of Stevie Wonder taking the stage. The crowd was electric. Tourists, locals, elders in Sunday suits, children in bright dresses, everyone pressed together under the golden glow of the chandelier as Stevie finished the final riff of his opening number. But just as the applause roared to "Life," Stevie lifted a hand, tilting his head with that unmistakable instinct that had guided him through decades of music. The band froze mid-movement, horns halfway to lips, drumsticks hovering in the air. The audience quieted instantly, sensing something unscripted tugging at Stevie's spirit. He lowered his chin toward the back of the balcony, a slow smile forming, as though he were hearing a secret melody no one else could catch. In the very last row of the upper balcony sat Aaliyah Brooks, an 8-year-old black girl with braids tied in blue ribbons and a dress 2 sizes too big, passed down through cousins and saved especially for this night. She'd begged her mother for weeks to bring her, promising she would sit quietly and behave. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't contain the tiny sparks of excitement that kept bubbling up in her chest. Aaliyah loved music, the way some children loved breathing. She sang everywhere, in the school hallway, in the grocery store, in the cracked courtyard of her apartment building, where her voice bounced off the cement like sunlight. But she'd never sung in front of more than a handful of neighbors. Tonight, she had come simply to dream. She never imagined Stevie Wonder would somehow hear the soft hum slipping from her lips as she sang along under her breath. Stevie lifted a single finger and pointed directly toward the balcony's darkest corner. "That little voice up there," he said, into the microphone, his tone warm, amused and full of certainty. "Sing that again for me." A wave of gasps rippled through the theatre. Ushers turned, audience members twisted in their seats, mothers lifted their children so they could see who Stevie was calling. Aaliyah's heart stopped. Her tiny hands flew to her chest as her mother whispered, "Baby, he means you." Every face in the balcony turned toward her, forming a tunnel of eyes and hope. Aaliyah froze, breath trembling, unsure if she should hide or run or simply disappear into her seat. But Stevie smiled from the stage as though he could feel her fear. "Come on down, little sister," he called gently. "We want to hear you." And just like that, an 8-year-old girl from the back row stepped into a moment that would change the rhythm of her life forever. Aaliyah's knees buckled the moment she stood, her small legs trembling under the weight of a spotlight she never asked for, but somehow had been chosen to receive. The balcony seemed impossibly high as she stepped into the aisle, her mother's reassuring hand resting gently on her back. "You're okay, baby," her mother whispered, voice trembling with equal parts fear and pride. The ushers rushed to meet them, clearing a path as dozens of audience members turned in their seats, offering soft smiles and nods of encouragement. Aaliyah kept her gaze fixed on the floor, terrified that if she looked up, the enormity of what was happening would swallow her whole. Her heart pounded so hard it echoed in her ears, drowning out everything except the faint, distant hum of music still vibrating in the air. All she could think was, "I'm just a little girl. Why me? Why me?" But her feet kept moving, carrying her down the long, winding staircase toward the glowing stage below. When she reached the main floor, the stage lights washed over her like a wave of warm gold. Aaliyah blinked in shock, her eyes adjusting to the brightness as she stepped out from the shadow of the crowd. Everything felt enormous, the room, the moment, the sound of thousands of breaths holding steady in anticipation. Stevie stood at the edge of the stage, his smile wide and welcoming, his posture relaxed as though greeting an old friend, rather than an 8-year-old child on the verge of tears. He extended his hand toward her, palm open, offering safety without pressure. "Come on, little sister," he said softly. "Let's make some music." The audience murmured in awe, watching the tiny girl with blue ribbons approach the legend who had shaped generations of sound. Aaliyah reached out timidly, her small hand slipping into Stevie's. As he guided her up the steps, her mother watched from below, hands clasped under her chin, whispering prayers into the thick New Orleans air. The moment Aaliyah stepped onto the stage, the entire room shifted. The lights dimmed slightly, drawing all attention to her small frame standing beside Stevie Wonder himself. The band remained frozen, their instruments hanging at their sides, as though afraid to play a single note before she did. Stevie knelt slightly to meet her at eye level, his voice gentle as he asked, "What's your name, sweet girl?" Aaliyah's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but no words came out, only a small, breathless squeak. The crowd chuckled softly, not in mockery, but in encouragement. Stevie gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's all right," he whispered. "You don't owe this room anything. Just breathe." Aaliyah inhaled shakily, her shoulders rising as she gathered the courage to lift her head. When she finally spoke, "My name is Aaliyah." Her voice was barely louder than a whisper, but the entire theater heard it, holding on to each fragile syllable like the beginning of a miracle. Aaliyah stood frozen in the glow of the spotlight, her small fingers trembling around Stevie's hand as she tried to steady her breath. The lights above her buzzed softly, warming her skin, and the vastness of the Saenger Theatre stretched before her like an ocean of shadows and expectant faces. She could feel thousands of eyes fixed on her, waiting, hoping, wondering if this tiny girl from the very back row could do something extraordinary. Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out her thoughts, and for a moment she wondered if she might faint. Stevie sensed the fear curling around her like a tight rope, and he leaned a little closer, lowering his voice to a gentle whisper meant just for her. "Aaliyah," he said, "you don't need to be big to be powerful. Just sing the way you do when no one's watching." His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, soothing the panic in her chest. She closed her eyes, letting the world fade to black, clinging to the memory of singing alone in her courtyard back home. Stevie slowly stepped back, giving her the space she needed while keeping his presence steady beside her like an anchor. The audience leaned forward in anticipation, the air thick with an almost sacred quiet. The band remained motionless, instruments lowered, eyes wide with curiosity and reverence. Aaliyah took one more trembling breath, and the microphone, still too big for her tiny hands, picked up the shaky exhale for the entire room to hear. The sound wasn't strong, but it was real, authentic, human. A hush spread across the theater, every breath held captive, as if everyone knew that whatever came next could either shatter her spirit or elevate her into something unforgettable. Aaliyah lifted her chin an inch, just an inch, and opened her eyes. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She wasn't looking at Stevie. She was looking inward, toward the part of herself that loved music more than she feared judgment. Then, without warning, she began to sing. The first note that left her lips was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried a purity that sliced through the silence like a beam of light in a darkened cathedral. The crowd gasped collectively, the kind of reaction that happens when the unexpected suddenly becomes miraculous. Her voice, though small, had a clarity that vibrated with emotion far beyond her years. The note wavered, trembled once, then steadied into something shockingly resonant. It wasn't the voice of an 8-year-old. It was something older, deeper, a sound forged from innocence, soul, and the raw beauty of truth. Stevie's smile grew slowly, spreading across his face like sunrise as he recognized what was happening. Aaliyah Brooks, the little girl hidden in the back row, had just released a note strong enough to shift the entire room's gravity, and the night was only beginning. The moment Aaliyah's second note soared into the air, the room seemed to vibrate with a force no one was prepared for. Her voice, still small, still trembling, carried a richness that felt impossible coming from someone her size. It wasn't loud, it wasn't polished, but it was pure, raw, and breathtakingly honest. The sound shimmered through the Saenger Theatre with a clarity that settled deep into people's chests, the kind that made hearts stutter and eyes widen. A woman in the front row pressed her hands to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. A man near the balcony whispered, "Lord, have mercy," under his breath. Even the ushers, usually stoic and focused, stood frozen in place with wide, tear-filled eyes. Aaliyah felt the tremor in her legs begin to steady as the note continued to drift outward, carrying her courage across the room like a fragile but determined bird testing its wings for the very first time. Stevie stepped back another foot, giving her space, real space, the kind reserved only for artists who could command a stage. But he didn't move too far. He stood close enough that she could sense his presence anchoring her like a lighthouse in the fog. The band behind them exchanged stunned glances, their mouths slightly open, their instruments lowered to their sides as they listened to the little girl who had turned the entire theatre silent. The pianist leaned forward with both hands, hovering above the keys, unsure if he should join in or simply let the moment breathe on its own. The drummer whispered a quiet "wow" and shook his head in disbelief, as though trying to understand how a child could produce a sound so hauntingly beautiful. The lights above the stage caught the shimmer in Aaliyah's eyes as she opened her mouth again, releasing a third note, stronger, warmer, gliding effortlessly into the rafters like it belonged there. As her voice grew in confidence, the audience fell deeper into its spell. It wasn't just singing. They could feel her story in it. Every time she inhaled, every quiver in her voice, every fragile rise of her tone carried traces of childhood afternoons spent singing into cracked courtyards, the echoes bouncing off worn brick like little promises. They heard the hours she had sung to herself because no one else was listening. They heard the fear of being small in a world that demanded loudness, and the bravery of choosing to be heard anyway. By the time she reached the end of her short phrase, a hush so deep covered the room, it felt like a held breath stretched across thousands of hearts. And when she let the final note slip out, soft as a sigh, bright as a prayer, the entire Saenger Theatre erupted with a sound so sudden and explosive that Aaliyah flinched, startled. The crowd couldn't help it. They had just witnessed a miracle born from the back row. The eruption of applause hit Aaliyah like a tidal wave, loud, sudden, overwhelming. She jerked back instinctively, startled by the sheer force of thousands of people cheering for her, a child who minutes earlier had been invisible in the shadows of the back row. The audience rose to their feet as if pulled by a single breath, clapping, shouting, crying, calling her name even though they had only just learned it. Aaliyah's eyes widened in disbelief, her small hands hovering near her chest as though trying to hold in the heartbeat thundering beneath her ribs. Her mother, still standing near the aisle, covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. To see her daughter, the little girl who sang while washing dishes, who hummed while tying her shoes, who whispered melodies into pillows, now standing on a stage receiving the roar of an entire theatre, felt like watching the impossible unfold in real time. But Stevie Wonder had heard what no one else heard, and now everyone did. Stevie stepped toward Aaliyah, moving slowly so he wouldn't interrupt the sacredness of the moment. His smile was warm, deep, proud, the smile of someone witnessing a destiny spark open right in front of him. He crouched slightly to meet her eyes, lifting one hand as if asking permission to approach. When she nodded with a tiny, breathless smile, Stevie rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Baby girl," he said softly into the microphone, his voice trembling with emotion. "You just shook this whole room." The audience roared again, even louder, as if agreeing with every word. Aaliyah smiled shyly, her cheeks glowing under the stage lights. She didn't know what to do. Should she bow, wave, hide? But Stevie squeezed her shoulder lightly, grounding her. "Don't worry about all that," he whispered with a grin only she could hear. "Just stand here and let them love you." The band, still stunned, finally snapped out of their trance. The pianist wiped his eyes and placed his hands slowly on the keys. The drummer nodded at Stevie, silently asking if he should join. Stevie lifted his hand slightly. Not yet. This moment belonged to Aaliyah alone. The crowd quieted little by little, settling into a reverent hush, as if preparing for whatever might come next. Aaliyah looked out at the thousands of faces staring back at her, faces full of hope, admiration, disbelief, and something inside her shifted. The fear in her chest unwound, slowly, carefully, like a ribbon being loosened. Her voice had shaken the room. Her voice had been enough. And as the final echo of applause faded, Aaliyah Brooks, a little black girl from the back row, stood taller than she ever had in her life. Aaliyah stood in the center of the stage, still trembling, but now with something entirely different, something warm, something expanding, something that felt like possibility stretching its wings inside her tiny chest. The crowd had finally settled, yet the air still buzzed with the electricity of what she had done. Stevie stepped back just enough to give her the full weight of the spotlight, but remained close enough that she could feel him there, steady and calm, like an anchor in deep water. He lifted the microphone again and spoke softly. "Aaliyah, would you like to sing a little more?" The question made her breath hitch. Sing more? In front of all these people? Her instinct was to shrink, to hide, to retreat into the fold of her mother's arms. But then she looked out, at the faces full of warmth, at the eyes shining with encouragement, at the little kids in the audience standing on their chairs to see her, and something inside her whispered, "You can." So she nodded, slowly, shyly, but with a spark of courage growing behind her eyes. Stevie smiled wide, pride radiating from him like light. He stepped back, gesturing gently to the pianist. This time, the pianist pressed a single, soft chord, a tender, rising note that wrapped itself around the theater like a warm embrace. Aaliyah inhaled deeply, her small fingers clutching the microphone, as if it were the last thread keeping her from floating away. She let her voice slip into the chord, releasing a line so delicate it felt like lace drifting through the air. This time, her voice didn't shake. It didn't hesitate. It grew, slowly at first, then stronger, fuller, echoing with a depth no one expected from a child. People leaned forward in their seats, hands pressed over their hearts, their expressions transforming from admiration to awe. Aaliyah was no longer simply singing. She was lifting the room, pulling every soul upward with her, weaving innocence and power into a single breathtaking sound. As she reached the end of her phrase, her voice rose into a note so clear and resonant it seemed to shimmer in the rafters. Gasps scattered across the room like sparks. A man in the second row stumbled backward into his seat, tears streaming down his cheeks. A woman near the stage clasped her hands together, whispering, "Dear God." The note, impossibly pure, rang through the theater until it finally broke into a soft whisper of air. And then, silence. A silence so profound it felt like the entire Saenger Theatre was kneeling in awe. Even the pianist froze, hands suspended above the keys, afraid to break the spell. Aaliyah lowered the microphone slowly, her chest rising and falling, her eyes wide with the shock of what she had just done. She looked up at Stevie, searching his face for approval, for reassurance, for grounding, and Stevie Wonder, legend, icon, master of music, stood with tears in his eyes, his chin trembling as he whispered, "Baby girl." That wasn't a note, that was a calling. The room erupted once more, but this time the cheers felt like a storm of pure love crashing around her. The roar that exploded through the Saenger Theatre felt different this time, wilder, deeper, charged with a kind of electricity that lifted Aaliyah off her feet without ever touching her. People weren't just applauding, they were shouting, pounding their hands against the armrests, wiping their faces, looking at each other in disbelief as if asking, "Did we really just hear that from an 8-year-old?" Aaliyah staggered back a step, overwhelmed by the force of it all. She had never heard applause directed at her before, not real applause, not from strangers, not from thousands. She stood stunned, tears welling in her eyes as she pressed one hand to her chest, unsure how to absorb love delivered at such a massive scale. Her mother sobbed openly in the aisle, hands raised in a gesture of worship, like the moment itself was a blessing sent straight from heaven. Stevie stepped toward Aaliyah, his movements slow, reverent, as if approaching something fragile and holy. He leaned down slightly, placing a gentle hand on her back, guiding her toward him. "You did that," he whispered, his voice cracked with emotion. "Not me, not them, you." Aaliyah covered her mouth with both hands, her tears spilling freely now as she shook her head in disbelief. But Stevie chuckled softly, the warmth in his voice wrapping around her like a hug. "Baby girl," he said, lifting the microphone again. Sometimes God hides the biggest voices in the smallest bodies. The audience erupted again, laughing through their tears, clapping and cheering for the little girl who had just shaken the room with nothing but a pure, fearless note from deep inside her soul. Aaliyah looked up at Stevie through her tears, a shy smile growing on her face, and in that moment she looked less like a scared child and more like a star, realizing her own light. Stevie turned back toward the crowd, lifting Aaliyah's small hand into the air like a champion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "remember this name, Aaliyah Brooks." The applause became thunder, rolling through the theater, shaking the walls, rising with such intensity that the lights above the stage seemed to flicker. Aaliyah gasped at the sheer volume of the love pouring toward her and instinctively buried her face in Stevie's side. He laughed softly, wrapping one arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. "It's okay," he murmured. "That's just the sound of a room realizing it's met someone special." Aaliyah peeked out, her face still wet with tears, but glowing with an unmistakable new confidence. And as the crowd chanted her name, Aaliyah, 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 the little girl from the very back row understood something she had never understood before. Her voice wasn't small, it wasn't accidental, it wasn't something meant to be hidden. Her voice could move a room, it could shake a theater, it could change her life. And tonight, it already had. Long after the crowd filtered out into the warm New Orleans night, the Saenger Theatre still felt alive with the echo of Aaliyah's voice. Empty seats held the memory of the moment like a lingering vibration, a soft pulse of something magical that refused to fade. Stagehands moved quietly, almost reverently, whispering to each other about the little girl who had shaken the room more powerfully than any headliner they'd ever seen. Members of the band lingered, near their instruments, wiping their eyes, shaking their heads, replaying the moment over and over, as if trying to understand how a child's voice could alter the atmosphere of an entire theater. Even the ushers, usually bustling to clear the aisles, stood in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones about Aaliyah Brooks, the 8-year-old from the back row whose voice had stopped time. Outside, Aaliyah walked hand in hand with her mother, both of them still overwhelmed by what had happened. The warm Louisiana air wrapped around them as they stepped onto the sidewalk, where groups of people who had attended the show now gathered in clusters, pointing, whispering, smiling through tears. "Is that her?" someone asked softly. "The little girl who sang?" Aaliyah's mother pulled her a little closer, not out of fear, but out of awe. She could hardly believe her baby had become the heartbeat of an entire theater. Aaliyah's braids swayed gently as she walked, her blue ribbons fluttering in the night breeze. She wasn't running or skipping or singing. She was quiet, still absorbing, still processing the impossible truth that Stevie Wonder had heard her humming from the back row and lifted her into a moment that felt like destiny taking its first breath. Back inside the theater, Stevie remained alone on stage for a long moment, his hand resting lightly on the microphone stand. He didn't need to see the seats to know where she had once sat. He could still feel her voice in the air, lingering like the last echo of a bell, warm and trembling and full of promise. He smiled softly to himself. "She's going to fly," he murmured. He placed the microphone back in its cradle, touched the piano keys once, and let a single soft note ring out across the empty auditorium, an offering, a blessing, a quiet celebration of the moment he had witnessed. Because sometimes greatness doesn't arrive in sequins or spotlights or rehearsed performances. Sometimes it comes in the form of a shy little girl with blue ribbons in her braids, standing in a spotlight she never expected, releasing a single note powerful enough to shake a room and awaken her own future. And on that unforgettable night in 2001, Aaliyah Brooks didn't just sing. She discovered who she was meant to become.